It's a great honor today to have Dr. Stephen Wolfram with me on the Ralston College podcast. Dr. Wolfram is a mathematician, a theoretical physicist, a computer scientist, and among many other things, the founder and CEO of Wolfram Research. Dr. Wolfram, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleased to be here.
I would like to start by speaking a little bit about education straight out of the gate. It was over educational topics that I think we first connected. You yourself had a very unusual educational trajectory. Though you attended Eton as a boy, for our listeners who don't know, that's a famous boys' school in England. You didn't, so far as I understand, actually quite finish high school. You then started at Oxford, but then left after only a year for Caltech, where after only another year, without either an undergraduate degree or having finished high school, you were awarded a PhD. It's an absolutely amazing educational story. And I know, of course, that you have very remarkable talents that in some respects make this not something that would apply, widely to just anyone. But at the same time, do you think there is something that others can learn from your peculiar path?
I got interested in science and particularly in physics when I was probably 10, 11 years old. And I decided I'm just going to learn about this topic. And, at the time, this was long before the web or anything like that. I discovered this amazing thing, like you could read a book and you could learn about something. And that worked really well. And then what I realized at some point was not only could you read books and learn about things, but you could ask questions that people maybe hadn't asked before. And, I wasn't at all into doing the exercises in the books. I never did that, actually. But instead, I would kind of make up questions that seemed to me interesting to try to answer, and I would try and answer them. And that got me into doing kind of physics research and so on at a pretty young age. I mean, as it turned out, I went to kind of Eton as sort of I was a scholarship kid at sort of the fanciest. It was kind of in the fanciest set of the. I didn't realize it at the time, okay, but as I realized later, I was sort of in the sort of top echelon of sort of kids who did exams to get into fanciest schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I was there, it was a lot of learning in Latin and Greek and things like this, and I was like, okay, I can do this. I have a good memory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of fun actually, but it's like I'm never going to use this stuff ever again in my life. Okay, so now it's sort of ironic that sort of right behind my desk I have a Latin dictionary and a Greek dictionary there. How come? Well, it's because I do things like try and name concepts and products and things like that. And it's pretty routine for me to want to go back to those, Latin, Greek roots and so on. But, what I think I would have said at the time, nothing I'm learning in school is worth learning. The only things that I'm learning that are worthwhile are things that I'm studying for myself and figuring out about physics and so on. As it turns out, I think a bunch of what I learned about, English writing, about sort of history, about those kinds of things, actually, I've used almost all of it. I mean, I think I've led a life where I'm trying to deliver, for example, computational knowledge to the world, and so that tends to, entail kind of sort of getting content about sort of everything you can imagine, But I think for me, the most significant thing about my educational trajectory probably was that I realized pretty early that, what I was really interested in was doing things that hadn't been done before. And that's what I spent a lot of my time doing. That meant, and I think I never kind of got the idea that should be hard, so to speak. And I also somehow, it wasn't, the actual navigation of the educational system wasn't completely trivial because, I was doing things where people say, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. That's a terrible thing to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You'll be all out of place if you're at this institution younger than everybody else who's there, or you'll do this and that and the other." I mean, I realized probably that the number one failure of my education perhaps was, I've spent some part of my life, CEOing companies, organizing things like that. But sort of the feedback from my educational process was a lot about, kind of, well, you're a science kid And, sort of the assumption is science kids are all geeks and they can't do things like organize companies and so on. And it took me a while to learn that that wasn't in fact the case in my particular example. And that would have been a terrific piece of feedback to have got from the education process. I didn't get much feedback about, sort of the do research thing, because I was mostly just doing that on my own. I wasn't doing that as part of sort of the education process, so to speak. But I think that it really helped me that I had a topic that I was kind of passionate about learning about and figuring things out about from a pretty young age. And although, as it turned out, by the time I was like 20, it had been my goal, be a physicist. So by the time I was 20, I was, by anybody's measure of that, a professional physicist, so to speak. And it was kind of good that that happened quickly, because then I thought, well, okay, so check that off. Now what else can I do? And so got into and got some confidence to try and do things where that were sort of further out on the curve of what people think might be possible and so on. I mean, ironically enough, about 40 years later, I got back into doing physics, and just in the last 6-9 months or so, and I made tremendous progress in physics. Probably in the end, kind of quite historic progress in physics. And it's sort of interesting to me that the 40-year gap probably is what made that possible, so to speak. That is, if I had just gone straight, I was a physics professor, if I just kept going and been doing physics for the past 40 years, I'm pretty sure that I would not have had a chance to do the things that I've been able to do recently, in sort of rethinking how the foundations of physics might work.
The way you've put this is just so interesting to me, and very inspiring too, because you've framed this about a kind of willingness to approach something unconventionally. First of all, you were able to do things you didn't know that you weren't supposed to be able to do. And this seems to be right at the heart of what a great education should foster, is precisely that spirit of independence. Do you have any advice to young people about how to direct themselves in terms of their own education, how to become independent-minded, to be open to what they might be able to do that they may not even know that they can do?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, look, I think my theory is for everybody, there is an interesting niche in the world. There's a place where their particular skills, talents, interests will be a fit. It's not trivial to find that place. And, it is a matter of luck whether you live at a time in history when the things that are sort of optimized for you are things that the world, has on offer, so to speak. I mean, if the thing that's optimized for you is, go find the source of the Nile or something, well, that's already been done. It's a question of, is the, and for me, I've been fortunate that for me, kind of the whole computation paradigm and thinking about formal systems in that kind of way is something that has been tremendously fruitful and tremendously much sort of just emerging in the world during the course of my career, so to speak. So I've been kind of lucky in terms of that timing. I wonder to myself, what would I have done 100 years ago? What would I have spent my time doing? I think recently I had concluded that I might be a zoologist, kind of collecting knowledge about the creatures of the earth, or maybe an encyclopedist or something. But it wouldn't, for me, I don't think it would have been, I think I've been lucky to have lived at a time in history when the particular things that seem to resonate with the kinds of things that I like to do and maybe even I'm somewhat good at doing are kind of, just emerging. But I think the number one thing is, what do you really like to do? What are you really interested in? And unfortunately, that's not so easy to figure out, because the first question is, what is there to do? I mean, what people get taught in school is a fairly narrow story, typically, about what there is in the world, so to speak. I mean, I remember with one of my kids long ago, he was doing homeschooling kinds of things, and it was like, let's just look at the encyclopedia. We look at the whole span of the encyclopedia, and let's pick out random articles and ask, are they part of the standard school curriculum? And the answer is maybe 1/3 of them are, and the other 2/3 are not. And they're things that are interesting and they're things which people do and people care about, but they just don't happen to be part of the packaging of what is provided in the sort of the standard, at least K through 12 education system. So I would say that the first thing is, what is it that you really find the most interesting? And sometimes you get clues about that because, there are things you study in school that you really like or that you're really good at or whatever else. But often it isn't the direct subject matter that is the thing that is the most significant to you about that thing. Like, kids who are really enthusiastic about math. What about math are they enthusiastic about? It could range from they like winning the math competitions, to they like solving the problems, to they like this kind of aesthetic formalism of mathematics, to even they like things where it's sort of obscure knowledge that other people don't have. There's a whole range of different things, and depending on why it is that you like that sort of affects your kind of how to generalize that to think about what kinds of topics or whatever else you might pursue. But for me, this whole question about sort of figuring things out for oneself and not just assuming that, for example, one of the very basic things is sort of the realization that sort of everything in this world that sort of is created as part of our civilization, somebody invented that thing. And, I get to see this firsthand in a rather interesting way, because we have this website product called Wolfram Alpha, which is a computational knowledge engine that answers questions for people, students, people who use Siri, people who use Alexa, whatever. These are, it's millions of people every day who are asking it all kinds of questions about the world, and it's trying to compute answers. But it's particularly used by students and technical subjects and so on. They'll use it to study things, do their homework, whatever else. And I quite often give talks to groups of students and so on. And it's kind of an interesting moment when they know, oh, they use Wolfram Alpha. They use it every day. And then they notice, oh, this guy's name is Stephen Wolfram. How can that be? It's similar to the name of this website I use every day. And there's this moment when they realize, okay, there must be some connection. This website is just a thing out there in the technological world. Somebody had to create it. And I think that's a realization that not everybody kind of ever has, that all these things that we see sort of as pieces of our civilization, they had to be created by somebody, and that somebody in the next generation could be you, so to speak. It's, I would say that for me, a large part of things I've done, it's like realizing that might be possible. For me, I always just assume it's going to be possible. I mean, people say you've done a lot of projects that involve a high degree of risk. For me, internally, they all seem zero risk, because I'm sure they're possible. And that's important when you lead teams and things, to project this notion of, no, it is not impossible, is kind of the most important thing in actually making a project happen. And I've been fortunate that no project I've ever tried to do has turned out to be impossible, though sometimes what exactly the project was changed a bit from my original conception to what actually came out. But I would say that having said that, for me, the projects I've done have arguably become increasingly more difficult over the years. And, if you start off, if I'd started off when I was first doing physics at age, 12, 13, whatever, saying, I'm going to go find the fundamental theory of physics, that would have failed. It wouldn't have been the right thing to do. Instead, what I did were much more modest kind of research things that were within reach and I could achieve. And then, 45 years later or something, came back and tried to actually nail, the big thing of find the fundamental theory of physics. But I suppose those are a few. I'm just a tremendous believer in this idea that for everybody there's kind of an optimal niche, but it's a big complicated puzzle to find that often. And I would say that in terms of education, the sort of learning about lots of different things is really useful. Learning facts about lots of different things is really useful, in my view. I mean, I'm reasonably fortunate in that I have a good memory, so once I learn facts, they tend to stick with me for a long time. But for me, as I've tried to do different kinds of things. Just knowing a lot about a bunch of different areas is really, really useful. I mean, in terms of how to how to think about things, for me, I spend all my time kind of trying to solve problems and trying to think things through. And for me, my particular approach to things tends to be, can I understand the foundational questions here? Okay, so I mean, a typical thing for me is, given a field, which I get interested in, it's like my first question is, what is the fundamental problem of this field? And often people will say, oh, the fundamental problem was thought about 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Nobody can work on the fundamental problem. It's just too hard. People have been, it's been 100 years. People haven't done anything on it. Well, it turns out it's often, the biggest sort of avoidance of the fundamental problem is often the wrong strategy, because, there are new methods since 100 years ago. And, if you go start looking at the fundamental problem, well, maybe you won't solve the whole thing in the form that it was originally formulated, but maybe you'll be able to make some new progress. If you're working on some tentacle, in some corner somewhere, you pretty much guarantee your progress is limited to sort of this small domain around the tentacle, so to speak. I mean, I make one more comment about this, which is, people, I think, sometimes don't recognize that, for example, in doing research and a lot of kinds of things, the strategy is often more important than the mechanics, so to speak. In other words, if you're doing research, the question of what are you going to do research about and how are you going to do it is often sort of the key determiner of whether you will be successful, much more so than the mechanics of how you do it. I mean, I've been really struck working on this fundamental physics stuff that I've been doing. I have a great deal more sympathy for things that Albert Einstein would say about his work on relativity. He was fond of saying that, people would say, oh, it's such advanced mathematics. And he would say, let me tell you, the mathematics is really difficult for me. And in other words, and I find the same thing. That is, the things I'm doing in physics require a bunch of mathematical and formal sophistication that is, in some cases, beyond what our civilization has reached so far. But some of it is kind of at the outer edge of what kind of pure mathematics has provided. But it's a big stretch for me to sort of apply that pure mathematics to the kinds of things I want to do in physics. But the fact is, I'm managing to get it done. And part of the point is, if it sort of had been left to the pure mathematicians, so to speak, they're studying very interesting things, but their strategy is quite different. It's not about, I'm going to try and find, pull this whole thread that gets me to the fundamental theory of physics. It's let me study this, this abstract mathematical thing that people have written papers about, that I can write another paper about. So, it's the strategy that kind of pulls the thing through more so than the mechanics, which, I'm probably not totally incompetent, but at these things, but it's still, it's a big stretch to reach the sort of levels of let's say, pure mathematical formal sophistication that are needed. So I think that that's a thing worth remembering, that it's something they don't tend to teach in school, right? They teach how to get stuff done, but not what you should do, so to speak. I mean, they tend to teach, like selecting a problem. I don't know whether there's any place in sort of the standard education process, and maybe this is something you're going to contribute, but there isn't a place where it's like, okay, so let's talk about, let's get practice in formulating questions, as well as practice in sort of doing the mechanics of answering the questions. So I think that's a big thing. And I see people who go through the education system and they've done really well. They've got all great grades and everything, but it's very fragile. They're on some track, and when something new and different comes along, they actually have to figure something out. It's like, oh my gosh, they didn't teach us how to do that. I mean, I've as a longtime employer of very talented, very educated people, I've had shocking experiences about that over the years, and it's and I think people find it almost sometimes that they feel like it's almost going back to middle school, which was the last time when they were kind of thinking flexibly, so to speak, before they got on this kind of you're going to do this, and then this, and then this, sequence of steps. And it's kind of a little bit, and some people manage to sort of preserve that interest in just sort of thinking about things broadly and figuring stuff out for themselves, as opposed to just, checking the next box and doing the next mechanical thing.
I'd like to stay with this for a minute, if you don't mind, Stephen, because this is, I think, just a huge question right now with respect to education. You used the term track. I often have called particularly in America, the approach to education kind of a treadmill. You go here and then you do your pre-SATs and then your SATs and you try and get into whatever a good college is and you get a credential there and then you try and get this firm or that firm. And what strikes me about that, the word you used was, I think, fragile, that it can produce an inability to connect with the deeper fundamentals that allow you to be more generative. And let me put this slightly differently. You mentioned the humanities earlier, and that you thought, I'm never going to use this, and yet now you have your Greek and Latin behind you, your dictionaries. Often, what people think of as the most useful actually can turn into this kind of robotic, non-creative, replicative mode of thinking that isn't independent at all, whereas actually what is most generative is what is most fundamental. But what is most fundamental is precisely defined by not being obviously instrumental. And it seems to me this is where one makes the greatest case for the humanities, is that if your whole education is defined according to some, I don't know, very strictly conceived instrumental outcome, you never learn the deeper skills that allow you to go towards the fundamentals, where paradoxically where the most useful things come out of. And so the paradox is that the most useful things one gets are often not acquired by trying to be useful, but by learning to go deep. Does this make any sense?
I think one has to realize learning deeply about anything is very useful. It doesn't really matter so much what it is, but the process of learning deeply about something is very useful. I think that some of the things are probably on the less useful end because they end up being essentially vocational training. I mean, I see this particularly, a particular, I would say, complex story right now is computer science education. So, at some of the elite colleges now, 70% of incoming students say they want to study computer science, which is completely crazy. What are they going to study? What are they going to get out of it? A lot of that is essentially vocational training for being a programmer. Now, it turns out if you look at like my company, which probably employs some of the sort of most talented kind of people in that crowd, some of them have sort of the standard computer science training, but a lot do not. And there is a very inadequate correlation between, I did computer science in school and I'm a really good programmer. I think one of my kids actually is fond of pointing out that in ancient Babylon, so computation, writing programs and things is kind of the new literacy in some sense. It's the thing that allows one access to, I would say, one of the new intellectual paradigms that probably the dominant new intellectual paradigm of this century, at least. A good analogy perhaps is to think about, what happened in ancient Babylon, where they're teaching people to read and write, at least the scribes and so on. And, one of the challenges is, okay, you teach people to read and write, but what are they going to read and write about? And even in the scribal schools of ancient Babylon, they would do a little bit of teaching about reading and writing, and then they would actually talk about the subject matter about which one might be reading and writing. And unfortunately, in computer science education, there's a sort of, because there tends to be this lack of, well, what are we going to teach? What are we going to write programs about? And that's an example of where this kind of the mechanical teaching of how to program is almost, that's not the important thing. The important thing, for example, here's a curious thing. So, you try and make up some algorithm for figuring something out. What they teach in computer science school tends to be given a very well-defined specification. How do you do the mechanics of making a computer do that? It's not given a vague question. How do you define that? How do you think about that computationally to the point where one could, in principle, write a program to have a computer do it. And I think that this, look, there's a complicated set of interlocking issues. I mean, one of them has to do with sort of the production line of education and the large number of people going through it, and the kind of, the assessment process and all this kind of thing. And, how can you assess people on, for example, if people are supposed to be inventing something original, how can you assess that? I mean, I'm fond of saying, for the sort of in the more research area, any subject for which there is a prize is a subject that has already reached the point where it isn't that original or interesting anymore, so to speak. And it's kind of anything that you can assess, so to speak, in a sort of mechanical way, is you've already removed some of the sort of human creativity and originality spark, I think. I mean, there's some exceptions to that, but that's but yeah, I mean, I think this question about how do you sort of teach thinking, so to speak, and how do you get people to apply it? So one of the things I'm sort of fond of being frustrated about, I suppose, is people's inability to take what they learned in one place and apply it in other places. And another way I like to put it is, do people actually even engage the thinking apparatus when they are confronted with some new thing? And you see people where it's like, they will be very sophisticated, quantitative, mathematical people, and then there's something that comes up in their everyday life or in some business situation where, gosh, a little bit of mathematical analysis would nail it. But no, they don't think of doing that, because that's a different box in their kind of cognitive setup, and they sort of never apply. I mean, I've this idea that you could take something you've learnt and apply it somewhere else, that requires sort of a jump of creativity or something that a lot of people don't have and don't get from their standard education. I mean, it's like you're in math class now. Oh, you're doing some history or something. No way can you do something mathematical to figure out something that will be relevant to your history class, so to speak. That's a different class. That isn't something you should do, so to speak. And I think people have, I mean, how do you teach that educationally? I'm not sure about that. I mostly observe. Well, actually, I mean, I in my own sort of efforts of kind of have a hobby doing a certain amount of education, it's always interesting to get kids and so on. You give them some problem, and it's like they know the sort of mechanical raw material to solve it. And after enough iterations, they finally get the idea, yes, you can take this thing from over here and start applying it to this new question that's come up. But I think it's a challenge.
Yes, well, there's no question that perhaps especially at some of the more notable institutions of higher learning in this country, we're producing, not in every case, but in many cases, people of extraordinary fragility who very much lack significant independence of mind. And there's a real sense, if you can't think laterally in the way that you're saying, you're not really thinking at all. I mean, thinking is precisely defined, when you say that the thinking apparatus is precisely defined by that ability to revert to fundamentals and to go further into deeper fundamentals to see how those come out in relation to the problem you're now thinking about, not simply to apply a kind of mechanistic, I have one program that I can run and that's it, but to be able to understand the deeper movements that allow you to grasp how those things are present in different forms. So this does seem to be connected with I think one of the great myths, particularly perpetuated, frankly, by many people in business who rightly seek to foster a kind of creativity and entrepreneurialism. Ironically, they often think the way to foster that is simply to, make more people who can fill this little box. But actually, the way you create is by making people who are grounded enough in the fundamentals that they can create things that don't yet exist in the way that you brilliantly said at the beginning. Being able to imagine what isn't there is the real key to creation.
Right. No, I think that's right, and I think that one of the things, it's worth realizing that this thing about taking initiative and doing creative things, I don't know if it's for everybody. I don't know. It feels like people at younger ages are sort of naturally tend to do that. But then later on, they don't. Now, is that because it was squashed out of them by the education system, or is that just because that is the natural course of certain people's evolution, so to speak? I mean, I think that, it's one of these things also in like a business setting, it's kind of like you have a certain number of leaders and you have a whole bunch of followers. If everybody was a leader, I'm not sure how well the whole thing would work out. So it's not the case that and not everybody, I think, wants to be sort of, thinking of something new and different every day. That there are people who I think, that they're on this track. They went to the fancy schools. They went to the fancy, the fancy top employers, the consulting firms, the big tech companies, the law firms, the whatever else. They're smart people in the sense of analytical skills. You give them a brain teaser puzzle, they'll probably be able to figure it out. You ask them some sort of radically different thing that requires sort of really rethinking things from the foundations. It's not what they do. And they don't really want to do that. And that's, it's worth recognizing that it's not for everybody. However, it's also, I think, important that, to have an education system and a setup where you force everybody to go through the track, that's sort of potentially disastrous for the future. Because, unless you want the world to only be what it is now and never to have anything new in it, then you kind of, there isn't, it isn't good enough to just get people on a production line that supplies sort of existing domains and with existing kinds of expertise. I mean, I don't think there's any question that our current, so to speak, system of education is by and large mostly geared to a kind of mind-numbing conformity. And of course, I agree with what you're saying that kind of, radical creation of new things is not for everyone. But yet at the same time, a kind of reflective independence about one's own life is so important, because even if you don't want to, shake up the whole of science as you do and have, you still don't want to find yourself middle-aged and thinking, I didn't really put any thought into the person I married and the career I chose and the belief system I have. And, now I find myself unhappy because I never stopped to think about it. And so a kind of independence, and I don't mean, questioning the deepest assumptions of the scientific disciplines, though that is what we need to do for others, such as yourself, but a kind of independence that allows you to live a free life is surely at the heart of the human experience. And a culture that can't do that is in real trouble. Right. No, I think that's a terrific and important thing. I think there are certainly people who go through their whole lives without ever having sort of had to think independently like that. And, I think it's a very complicated thing from the outside to say, is that bad? Is that good? But certainly it shouldn't be happening for 100% of people. And there are lots of people for whom, the kind of independence of thought and so on will be tremendously fulfilling to them and will greatly enhance their lives, if they get to that point. And, I've certainly seen, the pattern that I see all too often is, the bright kid who often from a fairly sort of successful background, they go to these, good schools and they work incredibly hard and they're very, very busy and they never get a chance. I mean, this is one of my current pet peeves is that, I think of myself, I spend a bunch of time doing science, writing things, running companies, things like that. You might think I would be fairly busy, but actually it seems like a bunch of the sort of high school students I know at least appear to be vastly busier than I am. And it's, and I think this is, for me, I spend a large fraction of my time actually thinking about stuff and trying to figure stuff out. And I think about new things I haven't thought about before, and I seem to manage to find the time to do that. But of course, I'm not doing every possible extracurricular activity and so on. And I think that one of the things that happens is, people, you said, they get on these kinds of tracks, treadmills, where it's like, I'm doing this because I'm going to do this next, because I'm going to do this next, and so on. And, they keep themselves very busy, so they don't really have a chance to even think about. And in fact, they sometimes are quite disoriented when they have a chance to sort of just think, so to speak, about something that isn't part of the exercise they're supposed to be doing, whatever else. And then, they'll go and they'll successfully, go to the sort of fanciest, most elite, most branded, educational institutions and so on. They will often find a lot of people who went through a similar track themselves, together with a few who slipped through the cracks and actually didn't go through such a track and ended up in those places anyway. But then the very common thing. So one of the things I've noticed, I talk to kids, I ask them, what do you want to do when you're grown up? So some fraction just passionately say they want to do this or that or the other thing. Okay, and it's always amusing to me that I'll kind of notice that 20 years later I'll see what they do. Most of those people did what they said they were going to do. I mean, they, by the time they were age 12, 13, 14, and they were passionate about something, maybe it diverted a bit. But, by the time they had real sort of passion for that thing, decent chance they got to do it. Now, there's a lot who are like going to the finest schools and so on and say, I have no idea what I want to do. Okay, so then what happens? So they go through, fancy colleges and so on. And then a couple of things happen. They'll either I think in the very end, they'll go to some career fair and there'll be some company that's recruiting, consulting firm, whatever else, and they'll sign up. And it's like, did they really, is this really what they want to do? Not particularly, but, they were supposed to, through the magic of college, they were supposed to discover what they wanted to do. And, well, it didn't quite work, but anyway, they have to do something. So they go off and join the consulting firm or whatever else. Or they say, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a gap year and I'm going to teach in whatever it is. I think then the bad thing that can happen is, they wake up at age 45 and they realize, oh my gosh, what have I been doing for the last however many years? I'm in some fairly, I'm on this treadmill, producing consulting reports, doing litigation, whatever else it is, seeing patients as a doctor or whatever. And, I'm not sure I ever really wanted to sign up for this, but it's kind of too late by then. And so, yes, I agree that this is but it's very hard for me actually to tease out the, I've been in the world of, running a company that tries to do creative things. I'm always looking for people who do creative things. And sometimes, you can take somebody who is good on one of these tracks and you say, now, sort of you slowly move them to something that isn't quite as much on the track. And they really don't want to be there. They want to be back on a track where there's a well-defined thing. They're going to, they can already say in 20 years, I'll be doing this. I'll make partner at my firm in such and such an amount of time and so on. And they, and it's very disorienting to do something different. Now, the thing to say is there's clearly a fraction of the population, and it's in the certainly double digits of percent, where they should be trying to do things that are not as tracked as that. And, I think the pity of it is that sometimes in the sort of the pecking order of things with education and so on, it's like, well, if you are successful at running down that race course, then, that's sort of what defines success. And if you're kind of the funky kid who's really creative and can come up with a lot of great things to do, but, well, you don't sit still for long enough to do really well in these tests, then sorry, you're out of luck, so to speak. And that's a bad setup.
I think this is just a huge question, the way in which the system itself is disincentivizing creativity, that it's actually unthinkingness that it is designed in a certain sense to produce. And there's a huge question, I think, about whether we as a culture can afford to have not all, but many of our, so to speak, best and brightest, a term that I think is absurd when you look at what these people actually produce at many colleges, but who are being incentivized simply to become kind of cogs, cogs in a machine, who furthermore are astoundingly fragile, whether intellectually or politically or otherwise, unable to confront the actual complexity of reality. You said something that I want to go back to, which I think is absolutely disruptive with the way most people think. And that is that you said something, and you may be being facetious, but you said that you, I think, find yourself to be less busy with all of the things Stephen Wolfram is doing than many high school students are. And this seems to me to go back to this paradox of depth and productivity, that people think that if you want to do a lot, you should just go off and get busy and go doing this and then that and then the next thing. Whereas in fact, it appears as though, and I was speaking to Cal Newport, you may know, the computer scientist and author of Deep Work, that actually the most generative place is thinking itself. And if that is so, which I think in a way all of life teaches us and the history of philosophy teaches us, I'd love to ask you about insofar as you're willing to share them, Stephen, your own habits, because I think many young people are simply not aware that scrolling through social media, 17 hours a day is actually not how human beings have always throughout history spent their time. And indeed, even in our own time, doing so is not conducive to creativity or productivity or indeed happiness. And so if you're willing to share with us a little bit, give us a sense of how disruptive your own habits are with what one might expect a busy entrepreneur with your success and creativity might be thought to have.
Well, I'm kind of a weird outlier in this. I've kind of been an enthusiast of sort of personal productivity and personal analytics and so on for a long time. So, like shocking, I am probably the human who's collected more data on themselves than anybody else over the last 30 years or so of, every keystroke I've typed and every, all of these kinds of things. But so my personal approach is, part of it is I've become pretty efficient at what I do. And I'm very, the parts of my life that are not about producing things and are not about sort of creating things, I've kind of minimized. I don't, I don't put a lot of thought into what I'm going to eat for breakfast each day. It's pretty much always the same. I don't put a lot of, I'm very habitual in the things that are sort of that I view as being not things that I have to figure out from scratch. That is, there'll be things where it's a routine for me. I'm doing this or that. Now, I have a complicated life with, I have a person who spends their full time basically scheduling stuff for me. So that's kind of an unfair comparison for the high school student crowd, although I suppose somebody is scheduling for them, but it isn't custom for them, so to speak. And I've learnt myself well enough to know, when I am doing such and such a project, here's how long it will take me to get up to speed, and here's what block of time I'm going to need to make progress on this. But I think that the main thing is just, okay, it probably helps that I become pretty efficient at the things that I do, but and I like doing new things. So that also helps in terms of getting things to the point that, perhaps there's another thing, which is that I tend to do projects where I sort of know the stages of the project and I get the project to the point where it's kind of done, and then I can move on to the next thing. And and I've also built for myself what I usually, and again, this is not necessarily applicable to everybody, but I built these kind of matrices for what to do with the things I do. So for instance, I have a blog, and when I'm thinking about certain kinds of things and want to think it through and so on, I'll think it through and I'll write a big blog post about it. And that's a thing that I do. If I didn't have that blog, I might study some piece of history and I don't know what I'd do with it. You know, I would have to imagine that I'm going to write a whole book about it, which would take much longer and be much less efficient. So having that kind of, one sort of matrix is that blog. I mean, also we build, I've spent the last 30-something years building this thing we call Wolfram Language, it's computational language. And an awful lot of ideas I have wind up as features of that language. I mean, thousands and thousands of ideas end up as features of that language, which then get, distributed as part of that language and used by millions of people and so on. And so that's, again, sort of a matrix for things I do. And there are other areas where I've never built a matrix for those things, like for instance, I don't know, inventing random stuff, coming up with I years ago I was like started I like to get some exercise even when it's terrible weather, and so I'll walk on a treadmill and I have a computer set up and I can type on the computer and so on. I figured out how to do all that, and I was thinking, oh, maybe I should file some patents about this stuff, and I thought, no, that's totally stupid. I have absolutely nothing to do with this. I mean, it's like I can throw this out there, but nothing's going to happen with it. So, but I think the applicable look, the main thing about sort of having time to do stuff is just deciding you're going to have time to do stuff, because it's, I could spend, if you look at the things, I like to think of it as I do these projects, they're often very big projects, and they have a tail that could last the rest of my life. I mean, again, I'm in a slightly different situation because I've got a company with 800 people in it that, take the ideas that I've had and try and do great things with them. So there's sort of a pipeline for, given that the thing is at a certain stage, how does it get moved forward without it taking over the rest of my life, so to speak. I think that for me, I try to, somehow when I want to do something new, I always manage to find the time to do it, even though I've got all these other things going on. And like this physics project that I was just started working on last fall, it's like, look, I've got a company to run. It's in a very active phase. We've got a bunch of products being developed. But you know what? I'm just going to spend some time and work on this physics project. And turns out, given the will to do that, somehow it manages to be possible. And perhaps it would be different if I was in a situation where somebody had scheduled me every hour of the day with classes I was supposed to take or something like this. Once you're in that kind of box, perhaps it's hard to work your way out of that. But which is why I always find it such a pity when I run into high school kids, because it's like, you don't have to be busy at this time in your life. Maybe there's another time in your life when you have to be busy because you're running some organization and it's in a very intense phase and there's things to do that will take 100% of your time. But it's not true. It really isn't true, because the only reason why you might be busy as a high school student is because you believe that by checking all these boxes you optimize the next step. And sometimes it's like, sometimes people are like, I really have to do this so that I can be at this place, so I can be at that place. And it's like, I'm always amused at the kind of be careful what you wish for sort of thought, because it's kind of like, it isn't actually, that sort of, you're kind of signing up for just more of the same, so to speak. It's, you're busy now and you say, I'm going to be busy now. It's like people who say, I'm doing all these things now because I'm getting ready for my retirement. And then they say, what are you going to do when you retire? And they're like, well, they come up with a few things, but in fact, that's what they should have been doing. They'll say, I'm going to do this when I retire. And it's like, why didn't you do that all your life? If that's what you actually want to do, why isn't that what you did? Why didn't you find a way to do that? Well, usually the answer is because they got sort of locked into some profession that, paid the bills. And by the time they kind of noticed that it wasn't the thing they wanted to spend their whole life doing, they were kind of at a state where they couldn't do something different because they wouldn't be able to pay the bills, so to speak.
I wish we could make a and maybe we will, make a 1-minute clip of Stephen Wolfram saying what you just said and show it to every high school student in the country. Because the basic assumptions that with which they have been encouraged to approach their life are not going to deliver the things they think they are going to deliver. The cult of busyness both stifles creativity and mitigates against finding deeper meaning. And so it's both of these things at once. And as you've said, it's only by actually taking the time to think that you can either discover the things that make your life worth living, or I might say, create things that are powerful, generative, lasting, new, etc.
I wanted to say one thing about thinking and about the process. Please. And so on. I mean, I am, for example, profoundly bad at just sitting and thinking about something. That's not what I do. I'm always actually in the process of doing something. So, for me, computation, computers, and so on, that's, when I'm thinking, I'm, typing computational language typically. I'm doing computer experiments, things like that. I'm not, for me, I mean, maybe other people are different, but for me, I find it very hard to just sort of sit abstractly and think without any kind of, without any interaction with anything. But for me, it's kind of like I'm doing a computational experiment, or I'm writing something, or maybe I'm talking to somebody. I mean, this is the, I want to sort of not give the impression that, I'm sort of reserving, the 15 minutes to just sit and think. I myself am profoundly bad at that. What I do is I think what works for me is, thinking with a, thinking in a medium, so to speak, whether it's writing, whether it's, doing computational language kinds of things. I mean, computers for me are really, really valuable because I sort of, I formulate something computationally in my mind. I tell it to the computer does something. I look at what it did. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Let me try to understand that. And it's a terrific kind of feedback loop. I mean, it's a feedback loop that I can also get by talking to other people, but it's pretty efficient dealing with a computer too. And for me, like writing and, is also important because that's the way that I actually get to understand what I'm talking about, so to speak, is, trying to actually explain it and sort of being honest in my explanation of not, actually trying to explain it in a way that is really getting to the point, so to speak. And that's so for me that, the concreteness of sort of thinking in a medium is important. The other thing that's important for me, at least, is I kind of have to know why I'm thinking about something. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier the importance that I at least place on sort of the strategy of what one's trying to do. What is the question one's asking, so to speak. But for me, if I'm trying to, for example, learn some field, and I just say abstractly, oh, I should learn about this field, I'm really pretty bad at doing that. But if you give me some, I don't know, there's one mathematical field, for example, where I've been meaning to learn about it for like 30 years, category theory, okay? Well, never got around to it. I tried a few times and it's like, it's just too abstract, I can't understand anything. Okay, but then now with my physics project, it's like, I think category theory is going to be useful for this thing. And once I have an objective, then I can be pretty effective at learning that field. And it's sort of an interesting process, this learning to learn a new field, learning about how to learn a new field, because I've had the good fortune to do that many, many times now. And it's always an interesting process because it's definitely a humility-inducing business because, you're learning a new field and you actually are starting from pretty much nothing. And if you start talking to people who do that field, it's like they'll tell you all these things and you don't understand any of them. And, my usual strategy actually, if it's a well-developed field, I tend to go look at the introductions to the well-known textbooks. That's a good strategy, particularly well-known textbooks written by sort of well-known people in those fields. Because once you get into the meat of the textbook, it's all mechanics and details and so on. But the introductory parts are often kind of somebody had to write down what was the main point of this field, what was the big picture. And what I found is then you start trying to, for me, I always have to have an actual question that I'm asking that's related to that field. And then I can, I'm always, I don't know, like pick a random field, I don't know, genomics or something, okay? Before I, a decade ago, got my own genome sequenced, I didn't really ever understand that very well. But once I had my own genome and I was curious to look at a bunch of things on the computer and so on, then I actually could start, really engaging in that field and learning about it. And I think that, and there's usually a time when I'm trying to learn about some new field when I'm, I don't know, some fraction of the way through, where I'll talk to people about it. And every person I talk to will tell me about some new thing that I've never heard about before. And then usually for me, it's a fairly sharp transition. There comes this moment when I finally get my arms around this field, and when pretty much every new person I talk to will tell me stuff where I say, oh yeah, okay, I know about that, that fits in here or there. And it's kind of this, the field is of a certain size, and you kind of have to explore all the pieces, and then eventually you manage to sort of wrap your arms around it. And I think often sometimes the way that fields are presented educationally makes it profoundly difficult to get to that point. But that's kind of a different issue.
Just picking up on that point, Stephen, what are your thoughts on the relation between intellectual humility and, let's call it, intellectual courage? On the one hand, to learn a new field, one has to be very humble. One's learning something that one doesn't know anything or very little about. On the other hand, to learn to think at all requires a certain courage to think things that, to follow the argument where perhaps other people have not yet followed it or even think is wrong to follow. How do you find a balance and cultivate a balance in your summer students, in your staff, and yourself, between the humility we need to learn and the courage that our thinking demands?
Yeah, I think the first point is I always believe in doing one's homework, so to speak. That is, one's learning about some field, and one could just try and figure out everything for oneself. But once one is on a track trying to learn about something, trying to figure something out, it's like, go see what other people have done. It's kind of crazy not to do that. I think that in terms of this question there's sort of a question of how much do you figure out for yourself versus how much do you take sort of accepted wisdom and go with that, so to speak. And I think that my wife is always fond of pointing out that I am very definitely on the side of figure out everything for yourself, right? So there are things where she's told me this or that thing, 20 years ago, she told me this or that thing, and I'm like, oh, just because everybody else says that, I don't believe it. And then finally, 20 years later, I come to that conclusion for myself. And then it's like, oh, I'm really going to do that or whatever. So, it's a thing where, but I think one of the things probably that's most important in terms of sort of figuring stuff out for oneself and so on is developing a certain degree of confidence that that's actually going to work out, that you can figure out stuff for yourself, and that it's it's not going to be a bad thing to do that. And for myself, I was fortunate in that I managed to have good success early in my life doing what was at that time perceived as sort of a top field, theoretical physics. And, I was sort of a top dog or something in that particular small, I'm mixing metaphors, pond. That experience definitely helped in giving me confidence to go and do other things. And so I think that this idea of, is it possible? Could I possibly do that? In my role as a leader of a tech company and so on, I think a large part of my role is just saying, yes, guys, it really is possible. This can really be done. And then also when they say, no, it's really, really impossible, going and trying and actually to solve the problem that caused them to say it was really impossible. But I think it really helps to build up a sort of foundation of confidence that one could figure out things for oneself. One did manage to do that piece of research, where one got figured out something that nobody's figured out before. And I think from an education point of view, and I've tried to do this with our summer school, for example, and summer camp, is, get people into something. You have a sort of a right-sized problem where they can tackle it in a certain amount of time, and they can see, I tackled something and nobody's ever done this before, and I managed to do it in some number of weeks and got some reasonable result. And that's an important thing to realize, that's for oneself, that one can do that one can do something that nobody else has ever done before. And not the standard education system, you just don't typically have that experience. At best, you're writing essays where, I think increasingly people are sort of, the essay has to follow exactly in this box and have this paragraphs and things, which is quite deadly. But that's at least an opportunity to be able to say something that people haven't in detail said before. But I think, another thing I've noticed about people doing things is, when I've done a bunch of big projects in my life, other people have been involved in those projects. And what I've noticed is people who see a project that goes from nothing to something and are really somehow, watching it in detail, the meta learning that comes from seeing that process is incredibly valuable. That is, they go from seeing, it's just an idea, and sometimes they'll say, that couldn't possibly work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then pretty soon, a few years later, year later, whatever, it's like, oh my gosh, this is a real thing in the world. It really worked. And I think, I've noticed for people at our company, for example, there's a sort of a 10-year glow, at least, that comes from people who are involved in a project that went from nothing to something, and they just have a certain confidence that that's possible. And I think that for kids, for example, I have sort of a hobby of mentoring some kids. My own kids don't need that, so that's. I think that showing them this process, insofar as one can, of going from nothing to something, is really valuable. And I think that in terms of, I don't know what the best ways to kind of capture that in the educational process are, but I think that, I think a lot of, there are these fields, my son Alexander is keen on sort of philosophy education, and I think he has an interesting point there. The point that he tends to make is, if you're teaching about math, for example, the chances are, or physics, for instance, the chances are for the typical kid that they can have no particularly original thought about those things at the level where they are, operating in high school or something. But if you're talking about something like philosophy or ethics or some such other thing, sort of almost anybody can have at least locally original thought, so to speak, and can have an opinion about it and can talk about it. And I think that's a valuable concept there. I tend to think in the things that I'm involved in with computation, and I've spent a long time building this computational language, our Wolfram language system, whose goal is to provide a framework for giving people a way to think computationally about things, and to remove the sort of mechanical impediment to, I don't know how to program that, so to speak. Once you can formulate your thoughts computationally, and we're trying to provide a language in which you can formulate those thoughts in sort of the same kind of way that something like mathematical notation provides a way to allow people to formulate their thoughts mathematically. We provide them a way to formulate their thoughts computationally, and the actual ability for the computer to take those thoughts and do something with them. Well, that's sort of a new kind of medium in which one can kind of have, in which almost anybody can sort of have original thoughts, so to speak. In other words, in doing something, if you're sort of using computational methods on a field X, any field, pick your favorite field, philosophy, archaeology, zoology, whatever. If you use modern computational methods, you will, at least at this time in history, almost certainly be doing things that have never been done before. It's a way, it's a medium of, a paradigm for thinking, a medium of doing things that's just, it's vast, and it's unexplored, and it won't be fully explored for a very, very long time. But it's another place where you can go, and I notice people who come to our summer camp, summer school, and so on, they get fluent enough in our computational language that they can actually go to sort of any problem and sort of pick at it with some new tool. I mean, my son Christopher, for example, is big on doing this. He kind of learned our computational language when he was pretty young and is very fluent in it. And he can, he works on all kinds of stuff. He's been working on Babylonian astronomy recently, but it's working on just, given any kind of question about data. He was working on income distributions in the US. He was working on road networks in different countries, things like that. It's sort of remarkable because he's fluent in this sort of computational language tools. He can go to any sort of any area and start doing things. Actually, he's done something that's kind of charming. He's gone through now he's at sort of a fairly traditional university after some other adventures, but he's now at Brown. And it seems like every class he does, he picks the classes not based on, he picks classes with a sole strategy of pick a class that's about a subject he thinks is interesting. That's it. That's not and so that's ranged across a wide variety of things. But I've noticed this very charming phenomenon. I'll do a class about oceanography or something, and pretty soon he'll be using computational methods to do some research project in that field because it's really easy for him. And it's because he knows these tools, and given the subject matter, you kind of bash that subject matter with a different way of thinking, and it's really easy to ask questions that people probably haven't asked before, and certainly haven't had the wherewithal to answer before. So I think that's I would say that to me today, there are sort of two obvious vectors into kind of tools for thought. One is the tried and true kind of philosophy, liberal arts kind of vector. The other is probably the computational vector, which actually is closer than you think to the liberal arts vector. It just has, except it isn't the Babylonians teaching writing, it's, us teaching computational language, so to speak. But it's, this is just an organizing method for thinking. It's not that it's no more. It is not the important part is not the mechanics of interacting with the computer or whatever. The important part is the figuring out what you're going to interact about, and it just so happens that it's using a computer well as a giant power tool, so to speak, that you don't. That's newly available in the last few decades, and that I think had it been available back in in antiquity or something, we would have very different. Certainly, my current work in fundamental physics, Democritus would probably have got there if he had had the tools that I have. I mean, he was thinking along the right lines. He just was way off in terms of the the tool set that was available.
I just want to say how moved I am by what you've just described about your mentoring and the whole vision of what young people are able to achieve. I think the tragedy is that if young people are not encouraged to see themselves in great possibilities of discovery, if they're not encouraged to imagine that they might be capable of doing that, the tragedy is that they very likely will not. It's like having wings but not knowing you're made to fly. And if there can be few things more fundamental in education than inspiring that sense of possibility while also giving one the tools to do that. If one looks through history, for example, Pergolese's Stabat Mater, composed just before he was 26 years old. William Pitt was Prime Minister of England at the age of 21. The things that young people can achieve are as great and boundless as at any other age. And I don't think there's any question that that's not how young people are encouraged to see themselves, or how our educational system encourages them to see themselves. Gosh, you've just said some absolutely enticing things about the relation between computation and philosophy that I hope we might be able to speak about another time. This has really whet my appetite for a conversation about physics And I'm thinking that perhaps the thing to do, Stephen, if you're willing, is that we might be able to just have another conversation another time, rather than try and get into all the questions of physics right now, given that I know your dinner time may be coming. Would that be acceptable to you?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
We'll talk about philosophy at a different time.
Been very inspiring to me to hear your reflections on just what education can and should be. It's a matter we've given a lot of thought to at Ralston College, and indeed that is really our whole fundamental purpose, to foster real, deep, creative, fundamental thinking. Thank you so much, Steve, for your time today. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I was just saying it's a great thing to do. Go for it. Make it happen. Make it big.
We're going to make it happen. Thanks so much for your time today, Stephen. Your creativity and your tireless seeking of ever deeper understandings are an inspiration to me. Thank you.
Thanks.